Let's talk about mastering for vinyl. Should you send the same master that you use for CD and online, or should you prepare a separate master for vinyl cutting? That is what this video is about. Now, full disclaimer, I don't cut actual vinyl masters myself, and we don't have a cutting lathe here at Stockholm Mastering, but we do deliver lots of masters that will be used for vinyl cutting. And when preparing these, there are several things that we keep an eye and ear at, and in this video we will have a look at 3 of these things. My name is Thomas, and I have been working professionally with mastering for more than 20 years now, and I run a mastering company together with Sofia, and on this channel we try to put out information that could be useful for you if you are into music production. So first, let's talk a bit about how vinyl records work. A vinyl record has a continuous spiral groove that begins at the outer edge of the record and ends near the center of the record. And the groove, it wiggles, and when a stylus is following these wiggles, then there will be sound. And in order to get the groove onto the disc, then the mastering engineer has a lathe that cuts the groove into a lacquer master. The actual cutting is done by a diamond stylus that is attached to the cutter head. And the cutter head makes this diamond stylus wiggle while it cuts. And this wiggle creates the modulated groove that the playback stylus eventually will follow. And this single groove actually contains both the left and the right channels of the stereo signal. And this is done by letting the stylus move in 2 dimensions, both side to side and up and down. And the horizontal movement corresponds to the M signal, or the mono signal, or the sum signal. And the vertical movement, the up and down movement, corresponds to the S signal, or the side signal, or difference signal. Now, the groove is cut as a continuous spiral, and it starts at the edge of the disc, and for each revolution of the disc, then the cutting head needs to move a bit closer to the center of the disc to avoid cutting into the groove that it cut the previous round. And the speed at which the cutter head moves is called pitch, and it is measured in lines per inch, or LPI, and the slower the cutter head moves, the higher the LPI will be. So a high LPI means that the grooves are very close to each other, and you can fit a lot of playing time onto the disc in this way. But having the grooves so close to each other will also leave less wiggle room for the actual music before the grooves start to crash into each other, and that will render the disc unplayable. So there will always be a balance between the loudness of the cut and the playing time of the disc. And so far, things are hopefully pretty intuitive, but there are, of course, a lot of details around this as well. And one of these details is the fact that the playback cartridge will not sense the position of the stylus or the displacement of the stylus, but it will rather sense the velocity of the stylus. And I know that this can quickly turn into a math lesson that might throw you and most definitely me into the deep end, so let's not go there. But the gist of it is that low frequencies will wiggle more than high frequencies in order to get the same output level at playback. And the result is that having lots of bass will also mean that you need to use a lower LPI and therefore have a shorter playing time compared to when you have less bass in the material. So cutting alongside with lots of bass usually means that the cutting engineer will either need to reduce the amount of bass or reduce the overall level in order to fit everything onto the disc. Another thing that needs to be considered is how deep the cut is. The stereo information is encoded into the up and down movement of the groove, and if there is a lot of stereo width in the material, then the groove needs to be cut with enough depth so that there is room for the cutting stylus to move up and down without lifting above the surface of the disc, because that would cause an interruption of this continuous groove, and the playback stylus would lose the tracking of the groove and probably jump somewhere else. And since the cutting stylus is shaped like a triangle, then cutting deeper also means that the groove is getting wider. So wide stereo will also make the groove wider, and that will also reduce the available running time on the disc. And to add to this, we have talked about how low bass generates more wiggle, and this is equally true for this vertical motion that comes from the stereo information. So wide stereo bass can cause lots of vertical motion and therefore needing a deeper and wider cut, and that will also eat up more of the available space on the disc. This is where the talk of monowing the bass for vinyl comes from, and this leads us directly to tip number 1. A recommendation that I've often heard when it comes to mastering for vinyl is that you should mono the bass. What this means is that there should not be any low end in the side signal. And this recommendation is well intended, and it's based on the real problem that we just discussed. But the wide bass might also not be a problem at all when cutting. It all depends on several parameters, including the running time of the side and what level it is cut at, how the actual cutting lathe is set up, and as well as the skill of the cutting engineer, because a good cutting engineer will know the tricks that you need to cut a full and wide low end without problems. The best thing to do, as I see it, is to let the cutting engineer decide whether the bass is too wide and let them take care of that in the best way possible. Otherwise, you risk making a master with less width and warmth than necessary. The important thing is that you make sure that it is possible to reduce the width of the low end without losing important musical information. And preferably, this needs to be done already in the mix, because it's very difficult to fix mono compatibility issues at the mastering stage. So the tip here is to listen to the mix in mono and make sure that you still can hear all of the important elements of the mix. If you can't hear all the important elements, then it's probably best to go back and tweak the mix if that is possible. Otherwise, you will just need to be prepared that the vinyl might not sound exactly like the master that you sent in for cutting. One thing that I will do when I'm mastering, if I notice that there are large swings in the width of the low end, is to either cut the low end with a low cut filter in the side signal or use a dynamic EQ with a low shelving band in the S signal only. And this is to keep the low end width in check. But I will listen very carefully so that this doesn't make the mix sound thinner or more narrow. But if the low end width is out of control, then this strategy will usually make the master more pleasant to listen to anyway, so I will do this whether the master will end up on vinyl or not. Otherwise, I will just leave the low end as it is and let the cutting engineer decide the best approach. Okay, let's talk about tracking. Because when we play the record, then the stylus will need to track the groove as closely as possible. It needs to follow every little wiggle in order to produce the sound that was cut on the disc. If the stylus is unable to track properly, then there will be tracking distortion. And tracking distortion can be subtle, but most of the time I find it to be quite unpleasant. The type of stylus that is used and how it is set up will also have a huge effect on how well it will track. I noticed a great improvement when I upgraded from a quite cheap stylus to a much better one. I could never find the right setup for the cheap one, and I always had lots of tracking distortion when I listened to vinyl records. But the more expensive one was surprisingly easy to set up, and now I can play pretty much any record with great tracking and very low audible distortion. But many people, including myself in the past, listened to vinyl records using a normal, affordable turntable with a less than optimal setup. And there will be tracking distortion, and it is somehow a part of the vinyl experience, although it's the part that I like the least. But still, some records sound clean and beautiful, even on the simplest of equipment. And why is that? Well, it has a lot to do with how much energy there is in the high end and in the high mids. Higher frequencies will create a lot of fast, intricate movements, and it can be difficult for the stylus to follow all these small peaks and valleys in the groove. And if the stylus jumps from a peak, or if it's too thick to reach into a valley, so to speak, then there will be tracking distortion. And great sounding records that track well on most players usually have a quite smooth and pleasant upper range, which leads us to tip number 2. The Loudness War, that's not a new phenomenon. It's been around more or less since the dawn of recording, although on vinyl there are actual reasons to cut as loud as possible in order to get far away from the surface noise. So the cutting engineer will usually try to cut as loud as the material allows. But peak limiting the signal before cutting won't actually make it easier to make a loud cut in many cases. There is no direct connection between the peak levels in the master files and how loud the vinyl can be cut. Many times, especially when using clipping, then loud masters actually tend to be more difficult to cut loud and clean than less limited masters. And I think of it in this way. The more information you have in the upper mids and above, then the harder it will be for the stylus to follow the groove precisely. When the stylus can't follow the groove, then there will be tracking distortion. And clipping and peak limiting will often add distortion to the signal. And the trick to good peak limiting is to make sure that this distortion is below the threshold where it is audible. But the distortion will still be there, and it will tend to end up in the upper mids and above. So this is right in the critical area for tracking distortion when playing back the vinyl record. So if the vinyl is cut loudly, then this additional upper mid grunge might cause tracking distortion. Then the distortion will no longer be hidden, but instead it will be exaggerated and clearly audible in the form of tracking distortion. On the other hand, if the master is clean with no peak limiting, then there will be no unnecessary extra distortion that can cause playback issues. And then the cutting engineer can also cut a louder vinyl master without risking tracking distortion. Because the cutting engineer can and will decide how loud or quiet the disc is cut, regardless of how loud the master files are. So what I do is that I prepare a separate master for vinyl cutting that is without the peak limiting that was used for the CD and the online version, which usually are much louder in level. And if the sound of the master is depending on the peak limiting in order to sound as it should, then I will at least back off as much as possible on the limiting and see if I can get the same sound using other methods instead. But when it comes to tracking distortion, then the biggest problem is sibilance, and this leads us to the next tip. High-end is even more difficult than the upper mids for the stylus to track. The peaks and valleys in the groove are spaced even closer, and the stylus needs to do even faster and more precise movements in order to track correctly. But luckily for us, most naturally occurring sounds and also most acoustically recorded music also tend to have a gradual decrease of energy at higher frequencies. So in practice, the high end of a natural sounding recording will usually cause no problems with tracking distortion, unless there is excessive sibilance. Because sharp S sounds or loud cymbals or aggressive synth sounds might all cause bursts with lots of high-end energy, and this will both cause trouble when cutting due to overheating and possibly destroying the cutter head, but it will also cause tracking distortion when the record is played. Tracking distortion from sibilance will usually sound very bad. You have probably heard it if you have listened to vinyl. But loud sibilance is not very pleasant to listen to even when it's not on vinyl, so I think it's a great idea to take care of these things anyway. I try to keep the high end as smooth and detailed as possible for all formats, but it's especially important for vinyl cutting. And if your music has a lot of high end and the sound is depending on that, then you should be prepared that the cutting engineer might reduce the high end and use some extra de-essing in order to create an enjoyable record. And also to protect the cutter head, which is very difficult and expensive to repair if it breaks due to overheating. So the vinyl record might not sound as bright and aggressive as the digital release if this is the case. So there you have it, some theory about vinyl records and some tips about mastering for vinyl. Let us know in the comments if you have any more tips on mastering for vinyl. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.